The first thing I felt was heat. Not embarrassment, not shock. Heat. Thick, sticky heat spreading across my lap, soaking into my dress, crawling up my stomach like something alive. For a split second, my brain refused to understand what had happened. Then the smell hit me. Tomato sauce, butter, garlic. Dinner. I looked down. The plate lay tilted near my knees, pasta sliding off the edge, sauce smeared across fabric I had ironed carefully that afternoon. I heard a few sharp inhales around the table. A fork clinked. Someone cleared their throat. And my stepsister smiled. Not a big smile, just the corner of her mouth lifting the kind of expression that disappears quickly enough to pretend it was never there. Her hand was still hovering in the air, fingers curled as if the plate had slipped on its own. "Oh," she said lightly. "Oops." That was it. No apology, no reaching for napkins, no attempt to help. Just that single word dropped between us like a dare. I waited. I don't know why. Maybe some part of me still believed my father would step in, that he would say her name sharply the way he used to say mine when I was a child and made mistakes. Maybe my stepmother would sigh and scold her daughter for being careless. But the silence stretched. My father stared at his plate. My stepmother lifted her wine glass and took a slow sip. No one said a word. If you've ever wondered what it feels like to be erased while still breathing, that's the moment I'd show you. We were seated around a long oak table in my father's house, the one he bought after my mother died and before he remarried. The dining room looked like something from a magazine. Soft lighting, neutral tones, a centerpiece arranged just so, everything polished, controlled, perfect, except me. I felt my face burn not from the sauce, but from the realization settling in my chest. This wasn't an accident, and this wasn't new. My stepsister Lily was 29, 2 years younger than me. She had grown up with my stepmother's full attention, her confidence fed daily by praise and protection. Lily never spilled things. She never bumped into furniture. She never forgot herself. Not unless she wanted to. "I'll get napkins," I said, finally my voice steadier than I felt. I stood up carefully, fabric sticking uncomfortably to my skin. No one offered to help. Lily leaned back in her chair, arms crossing loosely, watching me like she was bored. In the kitchen, I pressed paper towels against my dress and stared at my reflection in the stainless steel refrigerator door. I looked composed, calm. That almost hurt more than if I had looked like I was about to cry, because I was tired of being calm. This wasn't the first time Lily had done something like this. It was just the first time she had done it so openly, the first time she had tested how far she could go in front of everyone, and she had learned the answer. As I stood there dabbing uselessly at the stain, memories stacked themselves neatly in my mind. Birthdays where my gift was forgotten, holidays where I arrived to find my place setting missing, conversations that stopped when I entered the room, decisions made without me, then explained away later. "You're too sensitive." She didn't mean it like that. "Why do you always assume the worst?" I walked back into the dining room and sat down. The stain was still visible. No one commented on it. Dinner resumed, forks scraping plates, conversation shifting toward Lily's upcoming promotion, Lily's new apartment, Lily's plans for Christmas. She didn't look at me once. I picked at my food, appetite gone chest tight. My father laughed at something Lily said. My stepmother nodded approvingly, eyes warm in a way I couldn't remember them ever being toward me. And that's when something inside me changed. Not anger, not yet. Clarity. I realized then that this family had already chosen sides a long time ago. I had just been pretending the choice wasn't final, pretending that patience and silence would earn me fairness. They wouldn't. After dinner, as plates were cleared and chairs scraped back, Lily brushed past me in the hallway. "Careful," she murmured just loud enough for me to hear. "You're so clumsy these days." I turned to look at her. She met my eyes calm and challenging. That was the moment I made a decision. I wouldn't confront her. Not yet. I wouldn't cry or plead or demand apologies that would never come. I wouldn't explain myself to people who had already decided who I was. I would watch. I would remember. And I would wait. Because people like Lily always believe they're untouchable. They get careless. They underestimate quiet women who have learned how to survive without protection. As I grabbed my coat and said my goodbyes, my father barely looked up. "Drive safe," he said automatically. I nodded and walked out into the cold night sauce-stained dress hidden beneath my coat hands, steady at my sides. They thought the evening had ended. They had no idea it had only just begun. I did not go home right after that dinner. I told them I had an early morning meeting and left with my coat still smelling faintly of gravy and wine. In truth, I drove aimlessly for nearly an hour, letting the quiet streets of a small New England town blur past my windshield. The humiliation sat on my skin like something sticky I could not wash off. My blouse was still damp where the sauce had soaked through. Every time I shifted in my seat, I felt it again, that moment replaying without mercy. The sound came back first. The soft, wet thud as the plate tipped. The sharp intake of my breath. The scrape of the chair legs as my stepsister pulled back just a second too late for it to be an accident. Then the silence. No gasp from my father. No sharp word from my stepmother. Just the polite clinking of silverware resuming as if nothing had happened at all. That silence had been louder than the spill. I was 31 years old, not a child. I had my own career, my own apartment, my own life. And yet in that dining room, I had felt exactly as small as I did when my mother first died, and my father remarried, bringing with him a woman who smiled with her mouth, but never with her eyes. My stepsister Lila was already seated at the table back then. Same posture, same tilted head, same practiced innocence. I pulled into a quiet overlook near the river and shut off the engine. The night air was cold and clean. I leaned my head back against the seat and closed my eyes, letting memory do what it always did when I tried to ignore it. When my father married Elaine, he said we were building a new family. He used words like fresh start and blended household. What he meant, I learned quickly, was that I would be expected to blend quietly into the background. Lila was 3 years younger than me. She learned early how to weaponize that. If something broke, it was an accident. If she took something that wasn't hers, it was a misunderstanding. If she said something cruel, it was a joke. And Elaine would step in with a soothing hand on her shoulder and say, "She didn't mean it like that." My father would nod, always nod. At first, I thought adulthood would change things. Distance would soften the edges. I moved out, built my own life, told myself the past was just that. But that dinner had proved something I hadn't wanted to admit. Nothing had changed. It had only gotten quieter. The next morning, my stepmother sent a message. "Hope you got home safely. Sorry about the mess last night. Lila can be clumsy sometimes." I stared at the words for a long time. No mention of apology, no acknowledgement of intent, just clumsy, the same word she had used for years. I did not reply. Instead, I went to work and buried myself in routine. Emails, meetings, deadlines, the normal rhythm of a professional life that existed far away from family dinners and forced smiles. Around midday, my phone buzzed again. This time it was my father. "Elaine says you left early. Everything okay?" I typed and erased 3 different responses before settling on the truth stripped of emotion. I was uncomfortable. The reply came almost immediately. "You're too sensitive. It was an accident. Don't make things harder than they need to be." There it was, the familiar dismissal, the rewriting of reality. I put my phone face down and felt something settle inside me. Not anger, not sadness, clarity. That night I stood in my shower longer than necessary, watching the water rinse away the last stains from my clothes. As I pressed the fabric between my fingers, I realized how symbolic it felt. I had been doing this for years, quietly cleaning up messes other people made, pretending they weren't intentional. I stopped. Wrapped in a towel, I sat on the edge of my bed and opened a box I kept tucked in the closet. Inside were things I rarely looked at. Old documents, letters, photos, pieces of a past I had learned to carry lightly. At the bottom was my mother's handwriting. She had been meticulous. She labeled everything: insurance policies, bank statements, notes to herself, notes to me. One envelope yellowed with age caught my attention. It was addressed to my father, never sent. I had read it once years ago, then put it away. I wasn't sure why my hand reached for it now, but when I opened it, something in my chest tightened. She wrote about fairness, about making sure I was protected, about not letting me be overshadowed in my own home. And then there was a paragraph I had glossed over before. "I've spoken to my attorney about setting aside certain assets directly for her. I don't want there to be confusion later, especially if circumstances change." Circumstances change. I read that line 3 times. The next day, I took a half day off and drove to an office I hadn't visited since my mother's funeral. A modest brick building with brass lettering on the door, the law firm that had handled her estate. The receptionist looked up, surprised but polite. She disappeared into the back, and a few minutes later, an older man with silver hair and kind eyes stepped out. He said my name slowly, as if tasting it. It had been a long time. We sat across from each other in a quiet room. I told him why I was there carefully, without accusation or drama. Just facts, just questions. He listened, then he nodded. There were provisions, he said. Documents created years ago. Some of them had been modified after my mother's death. Some had not. Your father was given certain discretionary powers, he explained, but not unlimited ones. I asked him what that meant. It meant he said that silence and politeness were not the same as consent. When I left his office, the air felt different, sharper, lighter. I didn't know exactly what had been done behind closed doors yet. I didn't know how deep the favoritism went, or how far it had reached. But for the first time, I understood something crucial. That dinner wasn't just about a spilled plate. It was a test. And they had assumed I would clean myself up quietly, smile, and let it go. They were wrong. Because once you stop pretending something was an accident, you start seeing patterns. And once you see the pattern, you can decide whether to keep enduring it or finally deliberately break it. By the time my phone buzzed again that night, this time with Lila's name on the screen, I already knew I wasn't going to answer. I was done reacting. Now I was preparing. I didn't go home after that dinner. Instead, I sat in my car for a long time, parked under a flickering streetlight at the edge of my father's neighborhood, watching the condensation fog up the windshield. The smell of spilled food still clung to my clothes, a sour mix of gravy and embarrassment. I kept my coat on even though the heater was running, because I didn't want to feel my own skin yet. I replayed the moment again and again. The way Lily's elbow had lifted just a little too deliberately, the split second where she looked at me, not surprised, not sorry, the silence that followed. Not a single word from my father, not a sound from my stepmother, just forks scraping plates and the low murmur of conversation resuming as if I were invisible. That silence hurt more than the spill itself. Growing up, I had learned to survive silence. After my mother died, my father remarried quickly. Claire arrived with her soft voice and careful smiles, and Lily followed soon after. Everyone said I was lucky to have a new family. No one asked whether I wanted one. By the time I was in my late 20s, I had trained myself not to expect fairness from that house. But that night reminded me of something I had tried to forget. They didn't just overlook me. They chose to. When I finally drove home, it was close to midnight. My apartment was quiet, almost too quiet, and I stood in the doorway for a moment before turning on the light. The mirror by the entry caught my reflection. A faint stain still marked the side of my sweater. I hadn't noticed until then how tired my face looked. Not sad, worn. I changed clothes slowly, folding the ruined sweater with care I didn't feel. As I placed it at the bottom of the laundry basket, a memory surfaced uninvited. Lily at 16 crying because her birthday party wasn't extravagant enough. Claire consoling her, telling her she deserved more. My father writing another check. Me at 16 working weekends to save for my first used car. My father telling me independence built character. At the time, I believed him. That night, my phone buzzed. A message from my father. Don't make a big deal out of tonight. That was it. No apology, no acknowledgement, just a warning. I stared at the screen until it went dark again. Something in me shifted then, quietly, permanently. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity that felt almost frightening, the kind that comes when denial finally loosens its grip. I made coffee, sat at my small kitchen table, and opened my laptop. I wasn't looking for revenge yet, not consciously. I was looking for understanding. I started with emails, old ones. Messages from my father about finances, about family arrangements, about helping Lily get settled. I hadn't paid much attention before. I assumed none of it concerned me. I was wrong. There were patterns, small ones, repeated phrases, references to accounts I wasn't part of, decisions made as discussed without me ever being present. By mid-morning, my coffee was cold and my chest felt tight. I took a break and went for a walk, trying to ground myself. The neighborhood park was nearly empty, the air crisp. As I walked, I thought about the last time my grandmother had been alive. She had always treated me differently, asked questions about my work, encouraged me, slipped me small envelopes with handwritten notes instead of cash. You notice things, she once told me. That matters. After she passed, everything changed. The house, the rules, the balance. That afternoon, I made the call I had been avoiding for years. David Monroe. He was a lawyer my grandmother had trusted, someone I vaguely remembered from her later years. I hadn't spoken to him since the funeral, and I half expected his number to be disconnected. It wasn't. When I explained who I was, there was a pause on the line, then his voice softened. I wondered when you might call. We met 2 days later in his office, a quiet place filled with books and sunlight. I told him about the dinner, about Lily, about the silence that followed. He listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. I can't discuss specifics without your authorization, he said carefully. But I can tell you this, your grandmother was very intentional. About what I asked, About fairness, he replied, and about you. The room felt suddenly too warm. There are things, he continued, that you were not meant to learn the way you are learning them. But silence has a way of forcing truth to the surface. I swallowed. Am I excluded? He didn't answer immediately. I think he said, finally, you were meant to be protected. And that protection was inconvenient for others. I left his office with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear. That dinner was not an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern, one that involved money control and a version of family loyalty that only flowed in one direction. That night my father called. I let it ring. For the first time, I didn't feel guilty about it, because something had changed. I was no longer waiting for them to see me. I was starting to see them instead. And once you truly see people, you can never go back to being invisible again. By the time Sunday arrived, the quiet had become louder than any argument. I spent the morning pacing my apartment, replaying the dinner over and over, not just the spill itself, but what came after. Or rather, what didn't come after. No apology, no acknowledgement, no clearing of throats, no awkward attempts to smooth things over. Just silence, thick and intentional. Silence is a language in families like mine. It says this is normal. It says don't make it bigger than it is. It says you are alone in this. I had grown up translating that silence. My mother died when I was young enough that most people assumed I wouldn't remember her. They were wrong. I remembered her hands always warm, her voice calm, the way my father used to listen when she spoke. After she was gone, the house changed shape. My father remarried quickly, not because he was cruel, but because he was weak in ways no one warned me about. My stepmother Evelyn arrived with her own daughter Claire, and from the moment they crossed the threshold, the air shifted. I learned early that peace in that house depended on my compliance. That Sunday afternoon, my phone rang. It was my father. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice already tired. I said yes because I always said yes. He suggested we meet at a small cafe near his house. Neutral ground, he called it. I arrived early and chose a table near the window. I wanted the option of watching the street if the conversation turned inward, the way these conversations always did. When he walked in, he looked older than he had at dinner. His shoulders slumped. His eyes avoided mine for just a second too long. We ordered coffee. He stirred his cup even after the sugar had dissolved. "I've been thinking about the other night," he began. I waited. "You know Claire didn't mean anything by it," he said finally. There it was, the opening move, not an apology, a defense. "She didn't even apologize," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "She didn't say a word." He sighed. "She's young, she's impulsive." "She's an adult," I said, "and so am I." He looked uncomfortable. That was new. Usually discomfort came later after I pushed too hard. "Evelyn didn't think it was a big deal," he added. "Of course she didn't." I wrapped my hands around my mug, feeling the heat seep into my palms. "Did you?" He hesitated. That pause was everything. "I didn't want to make a scene," he said. I almost laughed but stopped myself. "So instead, you let me sit there covered in food while everyone pretended it didn't happen." His jaw tightened. "You're being dramatic." There it was, the word that had followed me through every conflict since I was a teenager. "I went home and cried," I said quietly. "Not because of the food, because I realized nothing has changed." He leaned back, crossing his arms. "What do you want me to do now?" That question landed harder than the spill. I thought about all the answers I could give. I want you to defend me. I want you to choose me once. I want you to acknowledge that what happened was wrong. Instead, I said, I want you to tell me the truth. He frowned. About what? About why you always stay silent when Evelyn or Claire cross a line. He opened his mouth, then closed it. His eyes drifted to the window. "You wouldn't understand," he said. "Try me." He exhaled slowly. "Evelyn keeps the peace in this family." I stared at him. By humiliating me? By not escalating things, he corrected. The words settled between us like dust. That was when I understood something I had avoided for years. My father didn't stay silent because he didn't see the harm. He stayed silent because silence was easier than confrontation, easier than choosing, easier than risking his own comfort. "Does that peace include me?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. "Sometimes," he said at last. "Sometimes." I paid for my coffee and stood up. My legs felt unsteady, but my voice didn't. "I won't be coming over for a while," I said. He looked startled. "You're overreacting." "No," I replied. "I'm reacting appropriately." He reached for my arm as I turned to leave, then stopped himself. That small restraint told me he already knew I meant it. That evening, I sat at my desk and opened a folder I had avoided for years. Old family documents, emails, notes my father had forwarded to me without explanation. I had always assumed they were meaningless remnants of my parents' shared life before everything changed. Now I read them differently. One email mentioned a property I had never visited. Another referenced a trust set up years ago with language that felt intentionally vague. My mother's name appeared more often than I expected. My heart began to pound. I realized then that the dinner wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern that extended far beyond spilled food. A pattern of exclusion, of rewriting history, of slowly pushing me to the margins until my absence felt natural. I didn't know yet what that meant or where it would lead, but I knew one thing for certain. If my family thought silence would keep me in my place, they had underestimated how much clarity injustice brings. And once you see the truth clearly, there is no going back. By the time Sunday evening arrived, the anger had settled into something colder. Not softer, not forgiving, just quieter, more deliberate. I spent most of the weekend alone in my apartment replaying that dinner in my head in fragments I couldn't shut off. The scrape of Lily's chair as she stood up without a word. The way the sauce had soaked into the fabric of my dress, heavy and humiliating. The sound of my father clearing his throat and changing the subject, as if silence could erase intention. What hurt most wasn't the spill, it was the confirmation. That moment had crystallized something I'd avoided naming for years. I was not an equal in that house. I was tolerated, observed, occasionally tested, and Lily knew it. That Sunday night, my father called. I watched his name light up my phone for a long moment before answering. My heart didn't race. My hands didn't shake. That surprised me. "Hi, Dad," I said. "Hey," he replied. His voice was careful, not warm, not angry. Careful like a man stepping onto thin ice he pretended wasn't there. "Your stepmother and I wanted to check in. After Friday." I waited. "She feels bad," he added. "About what?" I asked. Another pause. "About the situation." "The situation? Did Lily apologize?" I asked. "No," he said quickly, too quickly. "But you know how she is. She didn't mean anything by it." I let the silence stretch this time. "Dad," I said finally. She looked at me when she did it. He exhaled long and tired. "You're reading into it." "No," I said. "I'm remembering it." He didn't argue. Instead, he shifted tactics. "You could have handled it better," he said. "Walking out like that made things uncomfortable for everyone." There it was, the familiar reframing, the unspoken rule that my reaction was always more offensive than the original harm. "I was soaked in food," I replied evenly. And no one said a word. "She's younger than you," he said. "Be the bigger person." I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I said I have been the bigger person since I was 12. That stopped him. He cleared his throat again. "Look, we're all family. We don't want tension." "I didn't create tension," I said. "I just stopped absorbing it." He sighed. "Your stepmother is sensitive. You know that." "Yes," I said. "So am I." We ended the call politely, which somehow felt worse than yelling. When I set my phone down, I realized something else. He hadn't asked if I was okay. Monday morning, I went to work earlier than usual. My consulting firm wasn't flashy, but it was growing. Quietly. Deliberately. And unlike my family, it rewarded effort instead of resenting it. Around mid-morning, I received an email that made my pulse quicken. Subject line: estate planning review attached. It was from an address I didn't recognize, but the signature caught my attention. Harold McMillan, attorney at law. The email was brief, polite, professional. It stated that he was reviewing documents related to my late grandfather's estate and wanted to confirm my current contact information. My grandfather. My father's father. The man who used to slip me folded bills at Christmas and tell me, "Never let anyone tell you what you're worth." I stared at the screen. I had assumed everything passed to my father. That was what I'd been told, repeatedly. I replied within minutes. Yes, this was my correct email. Yes, I was available to speak. He called that afternoon. Harold's voice was calm, measured, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who dealt in facts, not feelings. "I want to be clear," he said early in the conversation. "I can only share information you are legally entitled to receive." "I understand," I said. "There is a trust," he continued, "established by your grandfather. Portions of it were discretionary. Portions were conditional." My grip tightened on the phone. "And I'm in it?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "You are named individually." The room seemed to tilt. "For what purpose?" I asked carefully. He paused. "Education, business development, and personal independence." "Personal independence. Has it been distributed?" I asked. "Not fully," he said. "Some distributions were delayed pending certain conditions." "What conditions?" "Family oversight," he replied. "Specifically your father's approval." The cold settled deeper. "So he controls it," I said. "To an extent," Harold answered. "But that oversight expires." When I asked, "Soon," he said, "very soon." After the call ended, I sat motionless for several minutes. Suddenly, so many things made sense. The way my father discouraged my business plans. The way my stepmother framed my ambition as instability. the way Lily acted untouchable. They weren't just dismissing me, they were managing me. That evening, I went back to my closet and pulled out the dress I had worn to dinner. I hadn't washed it yet. The stain had dried dark and stiff across the fabric. I didn't throw it away. I photographed it. Up close, from several angles. Then I opened a folder on my laptop and named it something simple: records. Because if there was one thing I had learned, it was this: people who rely on silence panic when you start documenting. And the next time we sat down at the same table, I wouldn't be the one trying to keep the peace. I would be the one changing the balance. By the time spring arrived, I understood something I had spent most of my life avoiding. Silence in a family is not peace, it is permission. For years, I had mistaken my father's quiet for neutrality. I told myself he was trapped between loyalty and love, that he stayed silent to keep the balance. But after the dinner, after the spill, after the way he watched me wipe gravy from my dress, like I was cleaning up my own shame, I finally saw the truth. His silence had always chosen a side, just not mine. I hadn't been back to the house since that night. Not for Christmas, not for birthdays. When my father called, I kept conversations polite and short. When Marlene texted, I responded days later, if at all. And when Claire posted smiling family photos online, I scrolled past them without reacting. But I was not idle. The consulting firm I had built quietly over the past 3 years was growing faster than I had expected. I had focused on small, struggling, family-owned businesses, the kind often overlooked by big firms. I helped them reorganize operations, renegotiate supplier contracts, clean up finances, and modernize systems without losing their identity. What I never told anyone in my family was why I chose that niche. It was because I knew exactly how family businesses failed. I had grown up watching one from the sidelines. My father owned a regional distribution company founded by my grandfather decades ago. It supplied specialty materials to construction firms across several states. I had worked there summers in college, unpaid filing invoices and organizing inventory while Claire vacationed with friends. I understood the numbers, the clients, the weaknesses, and I also knew something else. The company was not as healthy as Marlene pretended it was. That realization came one afternoon in early April during a lunch meeting with a new client named Robert, a quiet man in his early 60s who owned a logistics firm. As we talked, he casually mentioned my father's company. "They've been late on payments," Robert said, stirring his soup. Not disastrously, but consistently. My pulse quickened, though I kept my expression neutral. "How late?" "Long enough that our accountant flagged it," he replied. "We're reevaluating our partnership." That night I pulled public records. Filings, liens, court notices, nothing dramatic on the surface. But patterns don't scream, they whisper. The company had taken on debt quietly, refinanced twice in 2 years, deferred equipment upgrades, lost 2 long-term clients. None of this would show up in family dinner conversation. Marlene liked to project abundance, stability, control. But the truth was more fragile. I didn't feel satisfaction when I uncovered this. I felt something colder, something steadier. Leverage. Around the same time, my father invited me to lunch. Neutral territory, a diner halfway between our homes. I almost declined, but something told me to go. He looked older. Not dramatically so, but the kind of tired that settles into a person when they are carrying more than they admit. We talked about the weather, about traffic, about nothing. Then he cleared his throat. "Marlene thinks you've been distant," he said. I took a sip of coffee. "I have been." "She didn't mean to upset you," he continued. I looked at him then, really looked. His eyes avoided mine, fixed on the table. "She didn't spill food on me," I said quietly. "Claire did, and no one asked her to apologize, including you." His jaw tightened. It wasn't worth making a scene. For who, I asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he said something that surprised me. "You've always been independent." It sounded like a compliment. It wasn't. "I had to be," I replied. There was no other option. He nodded slowly, as if hearing that for the first time. Before we parted, he asked a question he had never asked me before. "How's your business?" I smiled, not warmly, not coldly, just honestly. "It's doing well," I said. "Better than expected." He studied my face, searching for something. Perhaps weakness. Perhaps need. He found neither. 2 weeks later, I received an email from Marlene. She wanted help. The subject line was vague. Consulting inquiry. She wrote formally, as if contacting a stranger. Explained that the company needed an external perspective, that operations had become complex, that she had heard I was doing interesting work. She ended the message with a line that felt rehearsed. Family aside, this would be strictly professional. I sat back in my chair after reading it. The irony was almost poetic. The girl they had dismissed, the one they let sit in silence while food soaked into her clothes, the one they never defended. They were asking her to save what they were quietly losing. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I called David, the lawyer I had retained months earlier for unrelated reasons. If I consult for a company owned by family, I asked, what protections do I need? He paused. That depends, he said. Do you want to help them? I thought of the dinner, the spill, the silence. I want to protect myself, I said. He understood immediately. We drafted terms, clear boundaries, clear compensation, clear authority, and one clause that mattered most, full transparency. When I finally replied to Marlene, my email was polite, professional, brief. I would consider the role, under my terms. She accepted within the hour. What she didn't know was this. I wasn't walking back into that family business as the quiet stepdaughter anymore. I was walking in as someone who saw the whole board, and I had no intention of cleaning up anyone else's mess without finally being seen. By the time Christmas decorations started appearing in storefront windows, I understood one thing. With painful clarity, the dinner incident had never been about the food. It had been a message, a rehearsal for something bigger. And now the real performance was beginning. I noticed the shift during a Sunday afternoon visit to my father's house. The place no longer felt like the home I grew up in. The furniture had changed. The walls were filled with framed photos that carefully excluded my mother and more recently seemed to exclude me as well. Photos of my stepsister Lily appeared everywhere. Lily at college, Lily at Christmas, Lily smiling between my father and her mother Evelyn like she had always been the center of the family universe. I sat on the edge of the couch while Evelyn moved around the kitchen, deliberately loud clanging drawers and cabinets as if my presence annoyed the furniture itself. My father Richard sat across from me, flipping through paperwork with an intensity that felt performative. You look busy, I said. He didn't look up, just sorting things out. What kind of things? Evelyn answered from the kitchen. Estate planning. You know how important it is to be prepared. My stomach tightened. Estate planning. The words landed differently now. After years of being treated like an afterthought, I suddenly understood that silence, avoidance, and selective generosity were not accidents. They were strategy. Lily walked in late, her hair perfectly styled, her confidence effortless. She paused when she saw me, then smiled in that thin, rehearsed way she always used when adults were watching. Oh, you're here? I smiled back, still family last I checked. She shrugged and sat down beside her mother, crossing her legs. I just didn't expect you. Neither did I thought. Dinner that night was quieter than usual. Conversation stopped when I entered the room and resumed once I stepped away. I watched how Evelyn touched my father's arm when he spoke, how Lily leaned in. When estate matters came up, how my name was never mentioned, unless I forced it into the room. After dessert, Richard cleared his throat. There's something we need to discuss, he said. My pulse quickened. I sat straighter. Evelyn reached for Lily's hand. It's about the future. Lily nodded solemnly, like this had already been rehearsed. We've been reviewing the will, my father continued. Making adjustments, practical decisions. I waited. You're still young, Evelyn said to me, her voice syrupy. You have time to build your own life. And Lily, I asked? She needs stability, Evelyn replied instantly. She's had a lot of transitions. I laughed before I could stop myself. She spilled food on me and didn't apologize. That's her biggest transition. The room froze. Richard's face hardened. That again? Yes, I said calmly. That again, because it wasn't an accident, and neither is this. Evelyn stood up. This isn't appropriate. No, I said. What's not appropriate is pretending this is about fairness. Silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable. Finally, Richard spoke. We've decided Lily will be the primary beneficiary of the house. The words hit me, but I didn't flinch. And me, I asked. You'll receive a smaller portion, he said. Enough to help you get started. Get started. At 30 years old, after building my own life without their help. I nodded slowly. Is that all? For now, Evelyn said. That night I drove home with my hands tight on the steering wheel, not because I was angry, but because something had finally snapped into place. They didn't see me as family. They saw me as a liability. And liabilities get minimized. The next morning I met with Daniel Harper, a lawyer recommended by a colleague who owed me a favor. His office was quiet, neutral, safe. He listened as I told him everything from the dinner spill to the will conversation. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. Do you suspect undue influence, he asked. Yes, I said, and manipulation. He nodded. That's harder to prove, but not impossible. What about my mother's contributions, I asked. The money she put into this house before she died? That caught his attention. Do you have records? I have bank statements, I said, and emails. Daniel smiled slightly. That changes things. Over the next weeks, I dug through old files, storage boxes, forgotten folders. I found proof of my mother's investments, renovations she paid for, loans she forgave, promises my father had made in writing. Each discovery felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. Meanwhile, Lily's behavior grew bolder. She posted photos from the house captioned with words like forever and home. She referred to Evelyn as the family matriarch. She stopped acknowledging me entirely. Until the day she sent me a message. "You should probably stop digging. Some things are better left alone." I stared at the screen, my hands calm, my mind clear. That was when I knew. They were scared. And fear, I had learned, was the first crack in a wall that had been built to keep me small. I replied with 3 words. "I already know." And for the first time since that dinner, I smiled. By the time spring arrived, I understood something I had avoided my entire life. Silence had never protected me. It had only trained them to keep going. The dinner incident with my stepsister Emily had not been a one-time humiliation. It had been a signal. Once she realized she could spill food on me, smirk, and walk away without consequence, the behavior escalated. Little comments, eye rolls, convenient accidents. And every single time my father and my stepmother Claire did exactly what they had done that night. Nothing. No correction. No apology demanded. No acknowledgement that anything wrong had happened. What changed wasn't them. What changed was me. I stopped reacting. Outwardly, at least. Inside, I began documenting everything. Dates, words, witnesses, patterns. Not because I wanted revenge yet, but because for the first time I trusted my perception more than their narrative. And the pattern was undeniable. Emily wasn't just rude, she was strategic. She interrupted when I spoke. She redirected conversations toward herself. She borrowed things without asking, and returned them damaged, then laughed it off. And every time I set a boundary, Claire framed it as me being sensitive or holding on to the past. My father Richard watched all of this with the same distant expression he'd worn since marrying Claire. Present in body, absent in action. The breaking point came on Easter Sunday. Claire insisted on hosting even though she complained all week about the effort. The table was decorated in pastel colors, fake flowers, forced cheer. Emily arrived late wearing white, even though Claire had explicitly asked everyone not to. She sat across from me. Halfway through the meal, Claire brought out a cake she had ordered from a bakery downtown. She announced it proudly, describing the flavors, the cost, the effort. Then Emily laughed. "Wow," she said. "You really went all out. Guess that's easy when Dad pays for everything." Claire stiffened. My father cleared his throat. I watched closely. This was disrespect, direct, public. Surely now someone would say something. No one did. Claire smiled tightly and brushed it off. "Emily, stop. Stop. Not apologize, not explain, just stop." Emily glanced at me, eyes glittering, and leaned closer to the cake. "Careful," she said loudly. "Wouldn't want another accident." Her fork nudged my plate. Just enough to make the gravy slide again, not enough to spill. A warning. Something inside me went quiet. Not numb, focused. After dessert, I excused myself and went into the bathroom. I stared at my reflection and realized something unsettling. I wasn't hurt anymore. I was done. That night, I called the lawyer my coworker had recommended weeks earlier. I had hesitated, afraid it would seem dramatic. Now it felt necessary. His name was Michael Abrams. Calm voice, measured questions. He listened as I explained the family dynamics, the favoritism, the silence. Then he asked something that shifted the entire direction of my thinking. "Do you know how your father's assets are structured?" I hesitated, not really. "Do you know if your stepmother has legal authority over anything tied to you?" That question stayed with me long after the call ended. Over the next few weeks, I started uncovering truths I hadn't known to ask about. Family trusts, property titles, old paperwork from before my mother died, documents that had quietly changed hands when Claire entered the picture. What I discovered was worse than I expected. My father had set up a family trust years ago. It included provisions for children, all children, biological and step, except my name appeared once and then disappeared. Michael explained it carefully. Amendments, timing, signatures. Technically legal, morally devastating. Emily had been added. I had been excluded. The reason listed was vague, estrangement. I laughed when I read that word, a sharp, humorless sound. Estrangement implied distance, choice. I had shown up, over and over. I had eaten at their table, smiled through insults, accepted silence as love. And they had rewritten history to make my absence my fault. That was the moment revenge stopped being emotional and became precise. I didn't want to humiliate them. I didn't want screaming matches or dramatic confrontations. I wanted accountability. I wanted the truth to surface in a way they couldn't dismiss or minimize. And I already knew exactly where it would happen. Claire's birthday dinner. She had been planning it for months. A big one, extended family, friends, her church group. All the people who believed she was generous, warm, endlessly patient. The people she performed kindness for. I RSVP'd yes. Emily smirked when she saw my name on the list. She thought she had won. What she didn't know was that silence had finally taught me how to speak. And at that table with witnesses and documentation and timing on my side, the story they had told about me was about to collapse. Because this time when something spilled, it wouldn't be gravy. It would be the truth. By the time spring arrived, I understood something I had spent most of my life refusing to accept. Silence had never meant peace in my family. It had always meant permission. Permission for my stepmother to rewrite the rules. Permission for my father to look away. Permission for my stepsister Claire to grow up believing she could humiliate me without consequence. The dinner where she spilled the food on me was not an accident. It was a test. And everyone at that table had passed it except me. But Chapter 9 was where the balance finally began to shift. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning just after 8 while I was reviewing contracts at my kitchen table. The subject line was neutral, family estate update. The sender was a law firm I had never heard of. At first I thought it was spam. Then I opened it. The message was brief, formal, and carefully worded. It informed me that due to an upcoming restructuring of a family-held property asset, my presence might be required to confirm historical documentation related to my late mother. My late mother. I felt my breath stop. My mother had died when I was still young enough to believe adults always told the truth. After she passed, my father remarried within a year. He said it was for stability, for me. But no one ever talked about my mother after that. Her name was folded away like something embarrassing. I reread the email 3 times. Attached was a scanned document, a partial inventory list, handwritten notes, dates, initials, and my mother's name. I called the number listed at the bottom of the message. My voice stayed calm, but my hand trembled as I held the phone. The attorney explained that my maternal grandmother had transferred certain interests into a trust years before her death. Those interests included a percentage of a rental property portfolio that had recently been flagged during a sale. The issue was simple. The trust paperwork referenced a beneficiary who had never signed final acknowledgement documents. That beneficiary was me. I sat very still as he spoke. He asked if I had ever been informed of this trust. I told him no. He asked if my father had ever discussed assets connected to my mother's family. I told him no. There was a pause on the line. Then he said something that landed harder than any insult Claire had ever thrown at me. In that case, there may have been a breach of fiduciary responsibility. After the call ended, I sat in silence, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant traffic outside, the ordinary sounds of a life that had been quietly distorted for years. This wasn't about money. Not really. It was about erasure. I requested copies of everything, every amendment, every signature, every date. When the packet arrived, it confirmed what I had begun to suspect. After my mother died, my father had been named interim executor of certain assets intended to be held until I reached full adulthood. But several years later, after marrying my stepmother, the trust had been modified. Not dissolved, modified. My name had not been removed. It had been buried. The assets redirected into a broader family management structure. One controlled by my father, one that later financed renovations, private school tuition, and lifestyle upgrades that somehow always benefited Claire. I felt sick. Not because I was angry, but because it finally made sense. Why my stepmother never apologized. Why my father stayed silent. Why Claire felt untouchable. They had been spending something they believed I would never discover. I didn't confront anyone right away. I learned. I hired my own attorney. Quietly. Carefully. Someone who did not share social circles with my father. Someone who saw patterns instead of excuses. We reviewed everything. He didn't promise justice. Lawyers never do. But he did say this. You were not treated as a child whose interests needed protection. You were treated as an inconvenience. The word stung because it was accurate. The strategy wasn't revenge in the way people imagine it. There would be no screaming confrontation, no dramatic reveal at a family gathering. This kind of reckoning required patience. Over the next several weeks, formal requests were sent, notices issued, questions raised. My father called me twice. I didn't answer. My stepmother left a voicemail that was heavy on confusion and light on accountability. Claire sent a text that said, only, why are you doing this? I didn't reply, because Chapter 9 was not about explanation. It was about momentum. The law moved slowly, but it moved. And as it did, something else shifted too. For the first time in my life, my family was reacting to me instead of the other way around. At night, when doubt crept in, I reminded myself of that dinner. The silence, the stain on my clothes, the way no one stood up for me. This wasn't cruelty. It was correction. And by the end of that spring, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. They were afraid now, and they should have been. By the time the court date was set, I no longer felt like the woman who had sat silently at that dinner table with sauce dripping down her dress. I felt awake. The weeks leading up to the hearing were the strangest of my life. On the surface, nothing dramatic happened. I went to work, I paid bills, I answered emails, but beneath all of it, something was rearranging itself inside me. Old fears loosened their grip. Old habits of shrinking, of smoothing things over began to fall away. My father stopped calling altogether. My stepmother sent one message, short and carefully worded, asking if we could resolve this privately. I didn't reply, not because I wanted revenge in the childish sense, but because I finally understood something important. Every private resolution in our family had always required my silence and their comfort. I was done paying that price. The night before the hearing, I barely slept. Not from panic, but from memory. I replayed moments I had dismissed for years. The way my stepmother's daughter Claire had learned early that cruelty carried no consequences. The way my father would look at his plate whenever she crossed a line. The way apologies were never demanded of her, only explanations made for her. She didn't mean it, she's sensitive. You're stronger than that. Strength, I learned, had been their excuse for neglect. In the morning, I dressed carefully. Neutral colors, clean lines. Nothing that asked for sympathy. Nothing that invited judgment. When I looked in the mirror, I saw someone steady, not hardened, just grounded. My attorney met me outside the courthouse. He nodded once, professional calm. "You ready?" he asked. I thought of the dress soaked in food, of the silence afterward, of my father's eyes sliding away from mine. "Yes," I said, "I am." Inside the courtroom, everything felt smaller than I had imagined. The benches, the space, the quiet. My father sat across the room with my stepmother beside him. She looked composed, almost serene. Claire wasn't there. She didn't need to be. She never had. My father looked older than I remembered. Not weaker, just diminished, as if the authority he had always carried so comfortably no longer fit him. When the proceedings began, I listened more than I spoke. Documents were presented, testimony referenced, patterns established, not emotions, patterns. The judge asked direct questions about the trust, about the reallocation of assets, about why changes had been made without disclosure to all beneficiaries. My father's answers were hesitant. He spoke of intentions, of family harmony, of doing what he believed was best. The judge listened without interruption. Then it was my turn. I stood, hands relaxed at my sides. My voice didn't shake. "I'm not here because of the dinner," I said. That was just the moment everything became visible. "I'm here because decisions were made about my future without my knowledge, based on a narrative about me that I was never allowed to challenge." I paused. I was excluded not because I was irresponsible, but because I was inconvenient. I didn't fit the image that was being protected. The room was quiet, not tense, attentive. I described the pattern. Calmly, clearly. I didn't accuse. I didn't plead. I simply told the truth as it had unfolded over years. When I finished, my father wouldn't meet my eyes. The judge ruled that afternoon. The trust would be restructured, the undisclosed amendments reversed, transparency enforced, accountability restored. It wasn't everything. It wasn't punishment. It was balance. As we left the courthouse, my stepmother caught up to me. "You didn't have to do all this," she said quietly. "You've embarrassed the family." I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt nothing sharp at all. "No," I replied. I told the truth. What embarrassed the family was pretending it didn't matter. She watched me walk away without another word. That night, alone in my apartment, I poured a glass of water and sat on the couch in silence. No celebration, no victory speech, just a deep, unfamiliar sense of peace. The revenge wasn't loud. It was structural, and for the first time in my life, the tables hadn't just turned. They had finally stopped moving under my feet. By the time the deposition date was set, I already knew there was no going back. The house where we would all sit together again was not my father's. It was a rented conference room in a quiet office park outside the city. Neutral walls, no family photos, no history on the shelves. Just a long table, a pitcher of water, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights that made everything feel exposed. I arrived early. I always did now. I sat at the far end of the table, hands folded, breathing slow. My attorney Helen sat beside me, her presence calm and grounded. She was in her early 60s, sharp-eyed, no patience for theatrics. The kind of woman who had seen enough family drama to recognize manipulation the moment it tried to dress itself up as misunderstanding. When my father walked in, he looked smaller. Not physically, something else. As if the authority he had carried for decades no longer knew where to settle. He avoided my eyes at first, then glanced at me quickly, searching for something. Sympathy? Regret? Familiarity. He found none. My stepmother followed him, posture stiff, lips pressed thin. Her daughter Lila came last, chewing gum, eyes flicking around the room with barely disguised irritation. She looked bored. That still amazed me. We sat. The court reporter explained the process, swore everyone in. Her voice was flat practiced. She had no idea she was about to witness the collapse of a family narrative that had been protected for years by silence. Helen started with my father. Please state your full name for the record. He did. She asked about the trust. He hesitated, then answered. She asked about the business my grandfather had built. He shifted in his chair. She asked about the amendments made after my mother died. That was when his voice faltered. I don't recall the exact timing, he said. Helen nodded. That's fine, we have the documents. She slid copies across the table, clean, clear, dated. I watched his hands tremble as he picked them up. The story he had told himself for years was unraveling thread by thread. When it was my stepmother's turn, the temperature in the room changed. She smiled too much, crossed her legs carefully, played composed. Helen asked about her involvement. I trusted my husband to handle financial matters, she said. Helen tilted her head slightly. Yet your email address appears on multiple communications regarding revisions to beneficiary distributions. The smile froze. I may have been copied, she said quickly. Helen nodded again, copied and responding. She read aloud. In her own words, about fairness, about protecting her daughter, about how I was already independent and did not need to be considered further. I felt something loosen in my chest as the words echoed through the room. It wasn't rage. It was validation. When Lila was sworn in, she rolled her eyes. She was asked about the dinner, the spill. She shrugged. It was an accident. Helen didn't raise her voice, didn't argue. She simply played the recording. The audio was clear. Lila's laugh, her voice saying, "Oops, guess you should watch where you sit." The silence afterward was deafening. My father closed his eyes. That was the first time I saw real pain cross his face. Not when I had been humiliated. Not when I had left the house soaked and shaking. Now, when the truth was undeniable. When the damage had a voice, when it was my turn, I spoke steadily. I talked about patterns, about years of being minimized, dismissed, overlooked, about being told to be patient, grateful, quiet. I talked about how silence had trained me to accept less than I deserved, and how that night at dinner had finally broken something open. I wasn't hurt because of the food, I said. I was hurt because no one thought I was worth defending. My father looked at me then, really looked. And for the first time in my life, I didn't soften my expression to make him comfortable. The deposition ended hours later. Outside, the sun was already low, the sky washed in pale gold. My father asked if we could talk. I considered it. I don't think that would help either of us, I said. He nodded slowly. I never meant for it to go this far. I know, I replied. That's the problem. My stepmother didn't say a word. Lila walked past me without looking back. As I got into my car, Helen placed a hand on my arm. This is almost over, she said. No matter how it ends, you've already won something important. What's that? I asked. She smiled. Your voice. Driving home, I felt exhausted, drained in a way that went beyond sleep. But underneath it was something steady. Peace. The kind that comes when you stop trying to earn a place at a table that was never set for you. One chapter remained, and it would change everything. The night everything ended, it didn't end with shouting. That surprised me most. I had imagined raised voices, slammed doors, maybe even tears that felt overdue by years. Instead, it ended in a quiet living room with the soft hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen and the sound of my own breathing finally slowing down. We were all there. My father sat on the edge of the couch, shoulders slumped in a way I had never seen before. My stepmother Carol clutched a tissue she didn't use, and my stepsister Megan sat rigid in the armchair, arms crossed, jaw tight, eyes sharp with the same defiance she had worn at that dinner table months earlier. The dinner where she spilled sauce down my dress and smirked while I stood there burning with shame. That night had started everything. Now I stood in front of them calm in a way that felt earned. I'm not here to fight, I said. I'm here to be clear. My father looked up. His eyes were red not from crying, but from the kind of exhaustion that comes when denial finally collapses. You went behind our backs, Carol said, her voice thin. No, I replied. I went around silence. Megan laughed under her breath. You're really milking this, aren't you? I turned to her slowly. You poured food on me on purpose. You didn't apologize. And you knew no one would make you. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. That wasn't just rude, I continued. It was a test. And you passed because you learned something that night. My father frowned. What did she learn? That she could humiliate me and be protected, I said, just like she always has been. Silence settled heavily. I took a breath and placed the folder I had been carrying on the coffee table. Not dramatically, just deliberately. I didn't come for revenge the way you think I said. I didn't want to embarrass anyone. I wanted the truth, and once I found it, I wanted accountability. I opened the folder and slid the documents forward. The revised trust terms, the financial disclosures, the correspondence Carol never expected me to see. My father stared at the papers as if they might rearrange themselves. I didn't take anything from you, I said. I reclaimed what was deliberately kept from me, what was legally mine. Carol's lips trembled. You're tearing this family apart. I shook my head. No, I'm naming what already did. Megan stood up abruptly. So what, you think you're better than us now? No, I said softly. I think I'm done being smaller. That was the moment something shifted. Not dramatically, not loudly, but permanently. My father finally spoke. Why didn't you tell me you were hurting that night? I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized something painful and freeing all at once. Because you were sitting right there, I said, and you watched. He had no answer. I gathered my things and walked to the door. Carol didn't stop me. Megan didn't say another word. My father followed me into the hallway. I don't know how to fix this, he said. I put my hand on the door handle. I'm not asking you to. I left without slamming the door. Outside, the air was cool. Clean. I sat in my car for a moment, not because I needed to collect myself, but because I wanted to mark the feeling. Relief, grief, and something close to peace. In the weeks that followed, I rebuilt quietly. Not just my finances, my boundaries. I stopped explaining myself to people who had already decided who I was. I stopped hoping for apologies that would never come. I invested my energy where it was returned, not drained. My life became smaller in some ways, but truer. And the strangest thing happened. Without the constant weight of their approval hanging over me, I stood taller. I no longer flinched at family dinners I didn't attend. I no longer rehearsed conversations in my head. I no longer dressed or spoke or softened myself to be tolerated. I didn't win by humiliating them back. I won by refusing to carry their version of me any longer. If you're listening to this and you've ever been disrespected in silence, minimized in front of others, or taught that your dignity was negotiable, hear this clearly. You don't need permission to matter. Sometimes revenge isn't about payback. It's about walking away with your self-respect intact. If this story resonated with you, if you've lived something similar or are still living it, share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice might be the one someone else needs to hear tonight. And if you want more stories about truth, justice, and reclaiming your worth, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with me. Because silence protects the wrong people, and your story deserves to be told.